It's hard to deny that the foundation of the earliest civilizations was built on inequality and the desire of a minority to live in luxury at the expense of the majority. In fact, this principle has proven remarkably enduring and still persists today. Whether we'll eventually reach some form of fairness and equality or drift into even deeper inequality, I honestly can't say. From the very birth of civilization, those in power faced the challenge of governing society, which they tackled using two main tools. The first was the creation of laws, and perhaps the most famous example is the ancient Code of Hammurabi. While it claimed to establish justice and protect the weak from the strong, at least according to its preamble, analyzing the laws themselves reveals they largely served the interests of the wealthy elite. The second tool was the clergy, whose role was to convince ordinary people of the divine origins of authority. Egyptian priests, for instance, proclaimed the pharaoh as a god's representative on earth, not too different from later Christian teachings about rulers being ordained by God. The very foundation of the church as an institution can be traced to Apostle Peter's words, "Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Therefore, whoever resists the power resists the ordinance of God." Historically, the role of the clergy and the church was to create a compliant and controllable society. They achieved this through a simple method: enforcing dogma. Dogma is information presented as absolute truth, without evidence or logical reasoning. If someone dares to disagree with dogma and tries to challenge it, they're seen as going against higher powers. Such a person faces either intimidation, like threats of excommunication or condemnation to hell, or, if their words are a threat to the authorities and social order, they could end up with their own personal hell, like being burned at the stake. On the other hand, those who obediently follow, fitting the image of the sheep, mentioned alongside words like flock and shepherd nearly 100 times in the Bible, get a bonus. Historically, the priesthood and church functioned much like today's ministries of internal affairs, shaping public policy. In archaeology, two key markers of a true city or civilization are administrative centers and temples. The significance of temples isn't about society reaching some spiritual pinnacle, but about their role as symbols of governance, proof of a more structured and organized society. It was within the Catholic Church that the term propaganda emerged, meaning the dissemination of information. In the 17th century, there was even an organization called the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, which, although renamed, still operates today. Judging by the fact that Christians now make up about a third of the world's population, it's fair to say it's been quite effective. That said, the Church's role as a primary tool of governance began to wane with the arrival of the modern era. Back then, over 90% of the population were peasants living in small villages. But with the rise of urban environments, where dense populations spread ideas rapidly and literacy encouraged critical thinking, the Church's influence began to wane, especially when its actions didn't align with the core principles of Christianity. It's also worth noting something crucial for this discussion. Medieval feudal states were not national entities. Power didn't come from the people living on a territory who shared common traits, but from ruling dynasties that controlled as much land and as many tribes as their armies allowed. For the state, a peasant's role was akin to that of livestock on a farm. However, the emergence of the bourgeoisie brought new challenges. First, using slaves for any complex production was unprofitable. As far back as ancient Rome, the writer Columella noted that slaves lacked motivation, which led to a decline in agriculture. Tenant farmers working for themselves were far more productive. Second, with the advent of universal conscription, governments needed a way to motivate citizens. One solution was the concept of the nation-state, where power supposedly stemmed from the people, and the ruling elite derived their authority from the populace. From the 17th century onward, terms like patriot and patriotism began to emerge, framing loyalty to the monarch as service to the state. Over time, patriotism became an effective tool of state policy. As Mark Twain put it, in absolute monarchies, patriotism is handed to the people ready-made by the monarch's government. In England and America, it is furnished to the citizen by the newspapers and politicians. While such manufactured patriotism might be hard to stomach, Twain observed, people still swallowed it anyway. Meanwhile, Leo Tolstoy offered a different take. Patriotism, in its simplest, clearest, and most undeniable meaning, is a tool for rulers to achieve selfish, power-hungry goals. But today we're focusing on a slightly different topic: propaganda. By the modern era, governing and motivating urban populations had become increasingly difficult using only religious dogma. For this, slogans and specific appeals work much better. If you think manipulative propaganda relies on false facts and reasoning, that's not quite true. That kind of information doesn't stick. Classic propaganda needs to spark emotions. That's what leads to long-term memory retention. It taps into ancient instincts by drawing attention to threats. A classic modern example of a propaganda slogan is, "Our history has been rewritten by enemies." You'll often hear this from people who couldn't even tell you what's written in the actual history book. Slogans must not only be emotional, but also repeated as often as possible.
To push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Propaganda needs to be accessible to all layers of society, simple and easy to digest. That's why it often reduces events or concepts to absolutes.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
For example, all problems can be blamed on a single person, often the leader of an opposing country. This makes it much easier to stoke hatred. And to be clear, this isn't just my take. It's noted by Belgian historian Anne Morelli. On the flip side, all achievements are credited not to the state apparatus, but to one's own ruler. Today, there are countless ways to shape public opinion. Countries that haven't delved too deeply into this rely on basic techniques, like focusing citizens' attention solely on positive news, restricting access to undesirable sources of information, and, of course, the good old priesthood. Those who have mastered this craft take a page from Lenin's playbook, who said, "Of all the arts, for us the most important is cinema and the circus." They convey their messaging not just bluntly, handing people ready-made perspectives on events, but subtly, leading audiences to adopt certain opinions almost without noticing. The pinnacle of modern manipulation is when someone believes they've reached their conclusions independently. Meanwhile, if you introduce conflicting and divisive ideas into society, following the divide and conquer principle, you end up with a population that poses little threat to those in power. Instead of fighting for their rights or a better quality of life, people are busy debating things like the number of genders. Naturally, education and history textbooks play a key role in shaping the desired perspectives. History is a discipline designed to turn individuals into citizens. That said, most people forget the majority of facts from their school textbooks within a few years, if they even paid attention to them in the first place. However, one propagandistic point, in my opinion, tends to stick quite firmly. Before we get to it, we need to answer a fundamental question. What is a state? Most definitions describe it as a political form of social organization, or a central authority with sovereignty and governance over a specific territory. Essentially, when the form of power changes in a region, a completely new state emerges. For example, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, about 15 entirely new states were formed. According to international law, specifically the Vienna Convention, these states can only claim succession from the USSR. Even then, it's important to understand that a successor is a completely new subject of international law that merely assumes certain rights and responsibilities of its predecessor. As for state continuity, for instance with Kievan Rus, that concept doesn't really apply. This isn't just about legal norms. In feudal states, the source of power wasn't the people but a specific ruling dynasty. The idea of power being delegated by the people to a ruler hadn't been invented yet. Sure, a prince might sometimes be invited to rule or even expelled if the people had enough strength, but his seat would inevitably be filled by another ruler. The point is that states, as specific forms of social governance, are temporary phenomena. For instance, the Kingdom of France and the French Republic, the German Empire and the later republics, or the Russian Empire and the USSR. These are entirely different states. In fact, during its formation, the USSR explicitly rejected being a successor to the Russian Empire. There's also a more nuanced concept, a country. If a state is a structure of power, then a country is a territory tied together by cultural unity. This is where things get a bit tricky. Take Spain, for example, which includes Castile, Andalusia, and Catalonia. Or the United Kingdom, made up of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Then there's Belgium, Georgia, and states with national republics that have their own unique cultures. But what does all this have to do with history textbooks? Actually, everything. That's because most, if not all, history textbooks blur the lines between the concepts of a country and a state. They often reduce everything to a name and try to convince you of an unbroken, centuries-long history. If a state is young and relatively small, let's call it State N. Its textbook will be full of phrases like N as part of the Roman Empire, N in the Holy Roman Empire, N under the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, N in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and so on. Of course, none of these entities ever recognized something called N and simply considered this territory as part of their domain. Their rulers governed a mix of ethnic groups and populations. I've even come across a textbook that referenced a state or country in the context of the Stone Age. The problem could be solved by explaining that the text refers to the modern territory of State N. But this clarification is usually omitted, creating a powerful retrospective effect. Readers are led to believe that N has always existed, even if it was part of different states, and that it has maintained its current borders, often since before their ancestors even arrived in the region. To illustrate the absurdity, imagine describing the Republic of Tunisia as part of Carthage. For larger and more politically significant states, the story plays out differently. They tend to draw direct lines of continuity with the most powerful empires of the past, a tradition that goes way back. In the Middle Ages, everyone and their brother wanted to imitate Rome. Using the Roman or Byzantine double-headed eagle in your coat of arms, that was peak fashion. Nowadays, almost every state that arose on the territory of a former empire claims not just to be its successor, but its direct continuation. And this often works because most people don't have a clear grasp of what a state even is. The fact that, for example, the descendants of those who helped destroy Rome later tried to position themselves as its successors. That's just par for the course in history. After all, new states, like their predecessors, usually emerge by dismantling old ones. But to boost their significance, they have to weave together a unified historical narrative, a misleading retrospective. By focusing only on victories and achievements, they push the idea of greatness and superiority. Chances are, no modern state is entirely free from propaganda. The most dangerous ones, however, are those where it's hardest to spot. That's the hallmark of well-developed manipulation techniques. In the end, concepts like inequality, patriotism, religion, and propaganda itself can be judged in many ways. But all of them are fragments of humanity's historical mosaic, pieces without which we likely wouldn't have reached the modern era with all its pros and cons. As for whether today's world has more advantages or drawbacks, that's for everyone to decide for themselves.